Good evening, and thank you for coming out. Is this on? Yes. In 1969, tonight's speaker, David Wilcox, moved to Arizona from upstate New York, completing his PhD at the University of Arizona in 1977. After stints at WAC, ASM, and ASU, Dave migrated north to Flagstaff. He worked at the Museum of Northern Arizona from 1984 until his retirement in 2010, serving as head of the Anthropology department for much of that time. Dave has written extensively on the Hohokam and is particularly known for his studies of ball courts. He also has a parallel interest in the history of Southwestern archaeology. Hopefully you enjoyed his articles published over the last year in Glyphs detailing some of the deep history of Ark and His. There are more of these to come. Since his retirement, Dave has worked extensively with avocational groups, including the Verde Valley Archaeological Society and the Arizona Site Stewards Program. His career has been acknowledged with a number of awards, including our own Byron Cummings Award and a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Arizona Governor's Archaeological Advisory Commission. Tonight, Dave will share with us some of his long-standing research leading to a documentary history of the Hemenway Southwestern Archaeological Expedition led by Frank Hamilton Cushing. Please welcome Dave Wilcox.
Good evening, everybody. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
In the back? Okay. If I fade out a little bit, just raise your voice and say, talk louder. We'll be very informal tonight. I'm going to try to stand about in here so I can see you better and you can see me, and I can turn and see what's going on in the slides as I need to. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, John. Pleased to have a chance to talk about the Hemenway expedition to the Southwest of 1886 to 1889 as led by Frank Hamilton Cushing. Now, how many have heard of Frank Hamilton Cushing? Just most of you have. He's most famous as having gone out to Zuni, Pueblo in 1879 as part of an expedition from the newly created Bureau of Ethnology, a part of the Smithsonian. And when he got there, he learned the language, Zuni language. He was very interested in the Zuni religion in particular, and wrote during his time a number of classic articles about Zuni religion. But he had to leave Zuni because he also had become a Bo priest. He thus helped the Zuni deal with the outside world. And when military officers from Fort Whipple tried to take over the Nutria Springs, one of the places the Zuni had a summer farming operation, he spoke out against it. By this time, he'd met an editor of the Boston Herald who wrote an article about it, and others wrote about it, and it became too hot for these fellows, and Zuni today still owns the Nutria Springs. But the father-in-law of one of these officers was a man named John A. Logan, and if you know your Civil War history, you've heard of him as a general in the Civil War under Sherman, who'd become a senator from Illinois by this time, and in 1884 ran for vice president of the United States. He's not somebody you fool around with like that. And so he was a supporter, I think, of John Wesley Powell, who was the head of the Bureau in the Congress. And so Cushing had to come back from Zuni. And he was ill, though, and a friend took him up to Boston, where he'd been before. In 1882, he'd brought a group of Zuni leaders back to Washington, D.C., and they'd gone to Boston. And at that time, he'd met on quite a number of influential people there, including a woman named Mary Hemenway, who was a wealthy lady. And when he went back there in 1886, they reconnected in a way we don't truly know. But she invited him to come out to her place on an old farm, she called it, near Milford, which is southwest of Boston. And then in the summer up to Manchester by the Sea, where she had a large summer place with two houses. One thing led to another, and pretty soon she agreed to sponsor an archaeological expedition to the Southwest, which is what we call the Hemenway Southwestern Archaeological Expedition. Now, Curtis Hinsley, an intellectual historian, and I, in 1983, decided that we wanted to publish a documentary history of this expedition. It was the first to do archaeological work in the Southwest involving excavation that we can regard, at least as professional in character, the first. And there was a wealth of archival information about it that we had learned about, and we thought if we could pull it all together and organize it and put it out there in a coherent way, we could make an important contribution to the study of American archaeology. And this was in 1983, and we're still at it. And if I live another 30 years, maybe we'll get it done. We have published, though, a series of books, 2 books and a whole issue of the Journal of the Southwest, and a number of essays. We see Mary Hemenway here, and Frank Hamilton Cushing, and a painting of him we'll learn more about in a bit. And so, with that quick introduction, I want to go through some slides here. We have this 7-volume goal, so we have 5 more volumes to go. And I want to talk tonight mainly about the current status of this project and our latest book, a spin-off really of this project called Coming of Age in Chicago, the 1893 World's Fair and the Coalescence of American Anthropology. It turns out that Cushing was at the fair. We were able to get his diaries, as I'll discuss in a bit, about that time, and that led us to have a symposium about anthropology at the fair. And now, finally, 16 years later, we've published that book. And I have a copy of it right here in front, and there's a flyer for it if you're interested. Or I'm told that if you get onto Amazon, you can get it for about the same deal that the flyer talks about, if you're interested in early anthropology. Now, my introduction to this was as a Holcomb archaeologist. In 1978-79, I had a visiting appointment at ASU, and the spring dig, in the spring of '79, I was given charge of. There was to be a contract to work on a 60-acre area at what's Baseline and Hardy in Tempe, if you know where that is. And it was a big plowed field at the time. We brought out a wheel trencher and began to dig. I was told by Fred Clarke, who got me into this, that it was called Casa de Loma by a guy named Omar Turney, who'd worked in the Phoenix area in the 20s, putting together data about canal systems and archaeological sites. And a fellow had taken a picture of a platform mound with a shack on it at the time, hence that name. But it turned out that this was also a site that Cushing had worked on in 1887, and he called it La Ciudad de los Hornos. Here's Turney. Here's a famous map that Turney published in 1929, the year he died. But he published a monograph about Holcomb archaeology and called Prehistoric Irrigation in Arizona with this map and a compilation of a lot of important information about all the sites that are shown on this map and more. And the site of Los Hornos is shown here in the red dot. The Casa de Loma site is where that is. Tempe Butte, if you know Tempe, is up here. And this is Baseline, right here, and Hardy. Now, we trenched it with a wheel trencher, and then there was to be 76 housing units built on this property. And so we monitored the sewer, water, and electrical trenches. And that map by my colleague Jerry Howard shows the coverage that came about that way. And we did our best to record as many of these features as we could. Now, a few years after this, if you were going to do a project like this, the State Historic Preservation Officer would get involved, and there'd be a big contract. You'd get, an institution would get about $1.5 million to do this project, probably. At that time, we had 50,000. So we were a little limited in terms of what we could actually do, but we tried hard, and one of the results was this map. We also, in a water trench, found a Holcomb-style ball court that we were able to get a basic recording of. and a few years later, I was able to co-organize an international symposium on the Mesoamerican ball game and publish a book about that, which I'm glad to say is still in print. I was able to do a whole study of Holcomb ball courts and their interpretation, as was mentioned. Later on, this got me going on that. And Jerry Howard, by the way, this is Jerry Howard, who was very important in this project. This is a summary map of the feature distributions that we recorded. There were over 1,000 features, I think I mentioned. We were in 1990 able to publish at least a preliminary statement about what we found at the site. This is a drawing from Cushing's time of an earth oven, or Orno, which there are many at this site, and he named it in that way. Now, I'm going to turn now to who Frank Cushing was. When he was at Zuni, an artist, a friend, Willard Metcalf, made a drawing of him, which was published in Century Magazine. You see him there. And later, in 1895, Thomas Aikens painted this famous portrait of him in his made-up Zuni costume. If you want to know about Cushing at Zuni, a wonderful way to get a Zuni insight into it is to look at this book by the artist Phil Houghty, I guess you could pronounce it. There's a wonderful set of cartoons here. Also, there's a book now, Cushing at Zuni, which was edited by a man named Jesse Green. He was an English professor interested in Cushing's writing, and he had published a book about Cushing's writing, and someone in the family then gave him all of Cushing's diaries, as I mentioned. And so he used those and other archival sources to publish this wonderful book about Cushing at Zuni, to bring about a synthesis of all of that information. And knowing about our project, he was quite willing to let us have the rest of the diaries, copies, and I transcribed them into the computer, and they'll be all part of these other volumes that I've mentioned, in part. And they are what led us to do the study of the anthropology at the World's Fair. Now, at Zuni, the governor at the time that Cushing showed up was a man named Palawatwa. Here you see a photo of the plaza at Zuni at that time by Jack Hilliers, a Smithsonian photographer. And Cushing famously left the expedition, moved into Palawatwa's house, and was tolerated there, and in fact soon began to learn the language, something he had planned to do. His thought was that one could begin to learn about Indian people best by learning their language, and thus through the language you could begin to understand their religion and other aspects of their social organization and so on. Very innovative idea at that time. This is the group that he took back east in 1882 to Washington, D.C. You see Cushing here sitting in his costume at the foot of Palawatwa, his friend Palawatwa, and others of the Zuni leaders at that time. They went up to Boston and got seawater, and all in the newspapers, people talking about this, and giving talks to local societies, which they took the water back as sacred water for ceremonial activities at Zuni later on. Here's Mary Hemenway then, again. She was the daughter of a merchant in New York City named Tillotson, and married a man named Augustus Hemenway, who was a merchant from Salem, but did his work mainly in Boston. He had major operations in Venezuela. He also owned a 2,000-acre sugar plantation in Cuba, as an example of his activities. Now, I've given you a little homework here. When this is up online, you can sit and read this, I guess. I don't propose to have you do it tonight. Let me just point out a couple of key points here. She inherited about $2.5 million from her father in 1864 after he died. And when her husband died in 1876, she inherited, the newspaper said, another $15 million. She was regarded as one of the wealthiest women, probably the wealthiest woman in Boston at that time. In 1853, they had built a house on Mount Vernon Street, right across from the state capitol, right at the top of Mount Vernon Street. Her son, Augustus Jr., in 1881 married Harriet Dexter Lawrence, the daughter of Amos Abbott Lawrence, one of the famous Boston industrialists. So here's Mary and Augustus, who are not part of the elite of Boston. They're sort of outsiders. They've come in, but they became very wealthy. And the second generation, their children then marry into the wealth of Boston. It's a classic example of American upward mobility. You may notice from her dates that Harriet Dexter Lawrence lived to be over 100. And it was regarded as at the top of Boston society in her day. Now, Mary died in 1894, and the expedition ended at that point. So that's another key date. And within a few weeks of that, her son, who never really supported this whole business very much, it seems, gave the collections that had been made by Cushing and by the second director of the expedition, whose name is Jesse Walter Fuchs, another familiar name to you, I would hope. He gave it all to the Peabody Museum almost right away, and they still have much of it today. Now, here's again some more homework for you about who Mary Hemenway was. Right after her father died, she had independent means and could begin doing philanthropic kinds of activities, which she began doing. Her pastor, she was a Unitarian, and her pastor was James Freeman Clarke, whose church was the Church of the Disciples in Boston. And his idea was that his parishioners should become disciples. And she took that very seriously. And these are some of the activities, civic activities that she began to engage in using her means, and including building a major normal school. I mean, we're talking about a really big stone building in Wilmington, Delaware, for poor whites in 1871-72 after the Civil War. She supported the Hampton Institute, both blacks and Indians, later Indians. In 1876, famously, she put up $100,000 to save the Old South Meeting House in Boston. How many of you know the Old South Meeting House in Boston? A smattering of you. You can still go there, pay a couple of bucks, and go in and see this place where Samuel Adams sent people out to carry out the first Tea Party, the real Tea Party. Right. The real Tea Party. And many other famous events of free speech occurred there. And she helped to save it. There'd been a great fire in Boston, and the parishioners were going to sell it, and they moved uptown across from the Boston Library at Crowley Square, which is where the Boston bombing took place, if you know where that is. Sort of, and it was going to be torn down, and so she had very strong feelings about American history, as I'll say more about in a minute, and they were able to save it. And first major historic site in Boston in this way. And they began then doing also historical talks there. John Fiske, a famous a philosopher of the time, but one of the advocates of the social Darwinist ideas of Herbert Spencer in America, turned his interest to American history because of Mary Hemenway's support. They also published leaflets of original documents in American history, not the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, the first charter of Massachusetts, little things like that she felt everybody should know. She also then supported many efforts for women. Now you could call these conservative ideas about women's role in society. They should be competent in what they do, and cooking and have strong bodies, and athletics were important. and sewing, things of this kind. But she also, though, then did support the Hemenway Southwestern Archaeological Expedition, and when Cushing brought back the idea that the Casa Grande here in Arizona was in danger, that it needed to be preserved, she got a petition together to Congress and sent him down there to petition, to lobby for it. In early 1889, it became the first prehistoric site in the Southwest to be so preserved, in the country, really, to be so preserved. So I think it's fair to call her the godmother of American historic preservation with the Old South Church and the Casa Grande. Now, her pastor, her minister, James Freeman Clarke, was very interested in a man named Henry Vane, and when he died in 1888, friends of his commissioned a statue of Henry Vane, and if you go to Boston and go into the Boston Public Library, how many of you have done that? Off of Crowley Square, you go through the door and there's a vestibule. If you look to the left, there's this big bronze statue of this guy named Henry Vane. How many of you ever heard of Henry Vane? That's what I thought. I hadn't either. I'm so happy. Well, he's very interesting. His father was Henry Vane the Elder, was one of the main courtiers to Charles I of England. Became even the Secretary of State to Charles I for a short time, but then became among those who opposed him. It led to the English Civil War, and his son, meantime, or before that, had become a Puritan, and so had moved to Massachusetts in 1631. He was very well educated, though, being very wealthy and well connected. And he soon became governor of Massachusetts in 1636 to 7, a very short time. But that's the moment that Harvard was founded, for one thing, to give you kind of an orientation. There's also the time of Anne Hutchinson. You may know something about her. She was an outspoken religious fanatic. Yeah, Henry Vane, the younger, was a supporter of hers, but in the next election, John Winthrop became governor, and they tried Anne Hutchinson and banished her from the colony. And she went down and helped to found Rhode Island, but then was off in the wilderness and was killed by Indians. It's a famous New England story, American story. And it goes to the issue of freedom of religion, you know, and the separation of church and state, which are ideas that grew out of these experiences, and that Henry Vane the Younger became one of the principal supporters of. He was friends with Roger Williams, who he knew in this time he was in Massachusetts. He helped get a charter for Rhode Island, which recognized the right of separation of church and state. A very early example of that. And he became a parliamentary leader then. During the long and short parliaments, he did not participate in what's called the Rump Parliament, which tried Charles I and then beheaded him, sought to his beheading, which Oliver Cromwell, you know that name, led. But he was a supporter of Cromwell in many ways, and followed during the Commonwealth period that followed, but then he had a falling out with him, and Cromwell then died. His son Richard took over but couldn't handle it, and pretty soon we had the Restoration, what's called the Restoration, when Charles I's son, Charles II, came to power, and he had an amnesty for people who had been involved in the Civil War, except for the regicides, those who had killed the king. But Vane the Younger hadn't been part of that, but he was a dangerous guy nonetheless. He believed that the king and the people were bound by the fundamental constitution or compact, which, if the king violated, the people might return to their original right and freedom. Something, if you believe in the divine right of kings, which Charles II did, you would not think very highly of. And so he was tried in 1662 and then beheaded. Now, what it is in all of that history that Mary Hemenway thought was most important, or James Freeman Clarke, I still don't quite understand. I think it has something to do with this idea of a constitution or compact, but I'm still trying to learn more about that. My point, though, here is the seriousness with which she took American history and her duty to try to teach others about it. Her mother's name was Porter, if you know about the Salem witch craze, you may know that Porter was one of the key families involved in that. This was her family. So she felt a personal connection to American history going all the way back to the mid-1600s, I think. When she saw this guy Cushing then with his experience at Zuni Pueblo and his ideas about archaeology and how you could recover the unwritten history of an Indian people through archaeology, it seems like that's something that was one of the things that excited her and led to her decision to sponsor this expedition, which in the end cost her several hundreds of thousands of dollars over many years to promulgate. These are things we're still trying to fully understand. But I hope I've conveyed some sense of who she was and what a serious person she was. And I'll show you a little more about that. Now, this is her house at Pickwick Point in Manchester by the Sea. I'd love to see the film, by the way. Has anybody seen the film? A little cottage, you know. And next door to it, they built another one, which they call Casa Ramona, after the book by Helen Hunt Jackson, which in the mid-'80s influenced a lot of serious women like Mary Hemenway and brought them to the Indian cause in America. You may see here it says Lift, so another little cottage with amenities. This is where Cushing and his wife and sister stayed when they were up at Manchester by the Sea. Mary Hemenway then arranged to have 3 Zuni, including Palawatawa here on the right, come to Manchester by the Sea in August of 1886 with Cushing to convey to him the creation stories of the Zuni, and they would sit around the fire at night. Some of her Mary's lady friends say, and Cushing would talk to them and then would translate, and one of them said it was like listening to Homer. And I think he charmed her. That's another part of the story. You'd be charmed, wouldn't you? You think about that. And his sister-in-law, Margaret McGill, was a watercolorist and quite a wonderful artist, and she did these images of Wahusawa, one of those Zuni men who later became a chief, the governor at Zuni, important man. They did some weaving while they were there. You get kind of the cultural sense. Now, this is her son, Augustus Jr., which I think that look conveys a lot. And this is his beautiful wife, Harriet Dexter Lawrence, as painted by John Singer Sargent before she was married. Well, right after she was married, I guess it is actually. These were among the leaders then of Boston society. Now, another dimension of Mary Hemenway's social networks and her master, James Freeman Clarke, was part of what's called the Transcendental Club in the 1840s in Boston, which Ralph Waldo Emerson was a part of, her most famous part of it. There are many others. Bronson Alcott, another one. And Bronson Alcott is the father of the woman Louisa May Alcott, who wrote Little Women. And you can go to Concord still and go to their house. Have you done that? Fun thing to do. And behind the house there's this barn. And in the early 1880s, Bronson Alcott organized what he called a little exaggerated, perhaps, they called the School of Philosophy. And they had people come then and talk and listen to one another and debate about major philosophical ideas. And Emerson participated in this at the end of his life. And another man who did so was a man named William Tory Harris, who was from New England. He'd gone out to St. Louis. He became the head of the school system there. But there he met a lot of German people who knew about the Hegelian philosophy from Germany, and brought that to these discussions. And he was then became also then one of the major proponents of that philosophical perspective in American thought. And both Herbert Spencer and Hegel, I've read, had an influence on American business beliefs about what they were doing in their efforts. William Tory Harris in 1889 became U.S. Commissioner of Education, which he continued in that role until 1906. So you get a sense of how significant a man this was. He was another friend of Mary Hemenway, and when she started the Hemenway expedition, she created a board to oversee it, and she asked William Tory Harris to be the head of that board. So again, you see the kind of weight that's being brought to this enterprise. Another person that was asked to be a part of it was Secretary-Treasurer, was a man named Sylvester Baxter, who was that editor from the Boston Herald, who'd met Cushing out at Zuni and made him nationally famous by writing about it in Century Magazine and the Boston Herald and otherwise. Others that were brought into the expedition to work with Cushing were Herman Tenen, a Dutch physical anthropologist, who he'd met at Zuni in 1883 when Cott was here doing ethnographic research. And then Adolf Bandelier, who's probably more familiar to most of you as the ethnohistorian of the expedition, who again had become friends with Cushing when he was in the Southwest. Cushing then went down. One of the first things he did when they got going was to go down to Washington and talk to his boss, John Wesley Powell, get his blessing for doing this, and Powell had recommended that he do a reconnaissance to begin with. It was winter by this time, and so he'd go to Zuni. He went to Zuni for the winter solstice, which is today, so it's kind of nice. And then they took the train out to Ash Fork and went down to Prescott and then down into the Phoenix area, Phoenix and Tempe, where it was warmer, and not today, but it was then, and they got there by February actually, and they began finding all of these mound sites that we were talking about to begin with. And he got very excited about the relationships of them on the landscape to one another, the irrigation that linked them together, and he thought that there was a symbolic structure to it all that he thought was also that he could see in the Zuni religion. He saw some pottery that he knew he'd seen at Zuni, and was also present in the Salt River Valley. He was right about that. And so he persuaded Mary Hemenway that they should stay there and work on these sites to begin with, because he thought it had a direct connection to Zuni, something we don't necessarily agree with today. Now he hired a secretary, and this man was recommended to him. His name was Frederick WEB Hodge. He'd gone to night school at the Columbian University in Washington, D.C., and he knew how to map. One of the skills he had, he'd been a clerk at the USGS, and he came along then on the expedition. Eventually he married Margaret McGill, Cushing's sister-in-law, thus they became brothers-in-law, but conflicts arose as a part of all of that, as we'll talk maybe a little more about. In 1891 is when he married Margaret McGill. He'd by this time come back to Washington again as a clerk, but he rose to be the ethnologist in charge of what was then called the Bureau of American Ethnology from 1910 to 1918, and then he moved up to New York City to the High Foundation, where he worked for George High at the American Museum, the Museum of the American Indian, it was called, and High the carrot dangled to him to get him to do that was that he was able to dig at the site of Hawaku at Zuni, something Cushing had once hoped to do, and we'll show that a little more of that in a minute. And then in 1932, he went out to the south to Los Angeles and became the director of the Southwest Museum there until 1955. He died in 1956 at age 92. Had a very long and very distinguished anthropological career, something that we want to write an essay about in volume 3, and we've been procrastinating about that for a very long time because it turns out to synthesize all of that's a very complicated thing, as maybe now see. Now they got out to the southwest and they camped. And they had horses and wagons and so on, and they camped across from Tempe Butte. Initially, they called that Camp Augustus, although that didn't sway Augustus. Here's a bird's eye view in 1887 of Tempe. At that time, there's Tempe Butte, tiny little place at that time, and they dug in a mound. One of the first things they dug in turned out to have the first floor of it was filled in, just like the Casa Grande is, and then there was at least 2 stories after that. In the Casa Grande case, there's 3 stories after that. And it's a tower of some kind. They began to make drawings like that. I found the map data for the Losorno site, and Jerry Howard then was able to make this map back in 1985. And this is, there was a compound there and a platform mound in the center here. This is where they show a reservoir, but that's where we found, basically that's where we found that ball core. So I think that's what that indicates. There's another reservoir that's named up here that's 265 feet long and 90 feet wide, and that's probably a large ball core, actually. That's the only record of it, right there. The others are ruins. We don't know what they are. There's something. But the overall extent of it, we later could show is probably pretty correct. That the site as a whole, all studies combined, suggests is about 480 acres, and that's about what this shows here. Later they went down south of the river in Tempe, about 7 miles, and at a site they called Los Muertos, and they camped just north of it in what they then called Camp Hemenway. Here's a photograph of them at Camp Hemenway, camping in the desert, and then a newspaper drawing taken from one of these photographs of them camped out like this. They made maps, began to make maps. This is in, later Cushing wrote what he called an itinerary or day-by-day account. This is one of the illustrations that he prepared for that purpose. It's a cremation cemetery that's being shown here. Here's their map of that Hodge had a lot to do with creating of Los Muertos, and Camp Hemenway was somewhere up in here on there. Now later, a young man from Arizona went to Harvard in 1930, and they had this collection that had been given to them in 1894, and had been collecting coal dust ever since then, and nobody knew what to do with it. But here was this fellow from the Southwest who knew a lot about the archaeology of the region from which this collection, much of this collection had been made, and so he was persuaded to study it for his dissertation, which he did, and finished in 1934, and then later in 1945, Emil Walter Howry did publish that report in one of the classics in Southwestern archaeology. So here we see another whole dimension of the Hemenway expedition and what it led to, and as we continue to rethink and try to add new context and new information and enrich the story that can be learned, the historical record that can be created from all this information. Now Cushing, camping out in the desert, got sick, and he had to go to San Diego in California by train to get medical attention. His doctor sent him up to San Francisco to get further medical attention, And while he was there, he did give a talk at the Cal Academy of Sciences, and he had his portrait taken, which we have a copy of. He met many important people in California at the Cal Academy, and as the expedition continued, now they were about to soon to go up to Zuni. He went back to California a second time, and that time he brought a photographer from San Francisco to Zuni to participate in it. But while he was in San Francisco to begin with, he met William Randolph Hearst, who was a young man at that point. In 1887, he'd just become the editor of the San Francisco Examiner, and Cushing was a guy who made news, and so he assigned a reporter to sort of follow him around. He also suggested that he should take his yacht and go up and down the West Coast and explore archaeological sites, including to South America. But nothing ever came of that. But his mother did continue to have an interest in Peru later, Phoebe Apperton Hearst, you may know her name. In San Francisco, he met a literary woman named Kate Field, who was staying, I think, at the same hotel they were, and they became friends, and at the suggestion of Henry Burton McDowell, this newspaper reporter, it was the son of Irvin McDowell, the Civil War general who lost the first battle of Bull Run, you may know his name, or Fort McDowell on the lower Verde near Phoenix. It's the same man. Henry Burton McDowell had learned Chinese and was very interested in Chinese culture, and so he took them to a Chinese theater, and they published an account of what Cushing thought of the Chinese theater and the ideas there, and he made many comparisons with Zuni religion there, and he had many ideas about the similarities between Chinese religion and Zuni religion. And that, as we'll see, played a role later in other social networking that he did. Now, McDowell then came out to Camp Hemenway. Cushing was still in San Francisco, but he came out to Camp Hemenway. He interviewed many of the crew. He published a series of newspaper accounts of all of that, which we have now. And from photographs, they made drawings that were published in the newspapers, such as this one of one of the excavations here. Now, I did say earlier that he can be seen as doing professional archaeology, and we'll just pass right across from this onto the next, because the technique is not exactly what we want to desire anymore. So too here at Zuni, when they got there, Cushing had a house, and he wanted to expand it, which they did actually, and in doing that they dug for the foundations into a prehistoric site called Halawan. It's on the south side of the Zuni River, across from Zuni Pueblo proper, and just to the west of what's today called Halona Plaza, where there's a store, and the Ashiawan Museum is there today. Cushing's house is not there any longer. It's been taken down, but this is a photograph of it. This is a drawing he made of helipolychrome, which does occur at Zuni, and also they found in the Salt River Valley. That's that pottery I was talking about that he saw a connection of. Here we see them camping, though, initially before they rebuilt the house, and we see Cushing in the plaza in the plaza at Zuni at this time, photograph taken by E.H. Husher, the photographer from Tabor Company in San Francisco. Now, the 1906, the glass plates were all destroyed, right, in the earthquake in San Francisco, but the prints, and so quite a number of institutions have prints, including Harvard, and I have a list of all the ones that were made. I haven't found copies of all those prints yet, but many of them we do have, and they have something to say. Now later, this is a picture of the church at Hawaku. The Pueblo is on the hill to the right there, and E.H. Husher photo in 1888. And this is where Hodge later came, and from 1917 to 1923. And this famous picture was taken at that time of Hodge as an older man now, and A.B. Kidder, and many other famous Southwestern archaeologists who were there, Earl Morris here, Neil Judd here in 1920. Now, ultimately, my interest in Zuni led to us in 2001 having an advanced seminar at the Colton House at M&A for a week, and it led to a volume, which I'm glad to say was published only a couple of years later, called Zuni Origins, Toward a New Synthesis of Southwestern Archaeology. So if you're interested in reading about modern views about Zuni archaeology and Zuni origins, I would point you toward this 500-page tome. Now, here I want to turn then to our latest book, which we call Coming of Age in Chicago, the 1893 World's Fair and the Coalescence of American Anthropology, published in 2016, about a year ago now, from the University of Nebraska Press. And it started with a symposium at the Society of American Archaeology meetings in Chicago in 1999. It evolved, though, in terms of what we were trying to do as we went along. Some people who were involved dropped out, others, we brought others in. And in the end, it features 7 original essays and an introduction, 12 documents from the time, including long extracts from Cushing's diary of his time at the fair, and what we call a visual interlude of images from the fair, including racist cartoons. It's about what people thought of other people at this time, hence the anthropology of the fair. And in this book, we examine the trajectory of American anthropology before, during, and after the fair. This was something we came to later. And we went out as far as 1925, arguing that a consensus had formed by the time of the fair about the proper domain of inquiry for American anthropology, what we now call the four-field approach, plus folklore. So it's that consensus that was the critical moment of coming of age. Coming of age is of course, a play on Margaret Mead's book, Coming of Age in Samoa, if you know that book. Now, our analytical methods, I thought I'd quickly summarize here. We began with Cushing's diaries. They document the extensive networking he engaged in at the fair and made clear that the principal anthropological leaders with whom he interacted were John Wesley Powell, his boss at the Bureau of Ethnology, Frederick WEB Hodge, who was the curator of anthropology at Harvard University, at the Peabody Museum, and the head of the anthropology department at Harvard, and Daniel Garrison Brinton from Philadelphia, who was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania and an important figure in American anthropology at that time in terms of book reviews and other books that he published. He never actually had any students, though, even though he was one of the first professors. Pretty good work if you can get it. Franz Boas, as it happens, in 1909 at Putnam's retirement party, called these 3 men the 3 fathers of American anthropology. So we thus closely, in the book, we closely examine who they are, or were, and what brought them together at the fair, noticing their consensus about the domain of anthropological inquiry as a central fact of that encounter. Something also they see that Boas agreed with. He agreed with the four-field approach as what American anthropology should be about, plus folklore. He was a longtime editor of the Journal of American Folklore, for example. Second, we examine other key players and the manner of their interaction with the audiences who attended the fair, their patrons, their successes or failures, and their relationship to the new American world that the fair celebrated. And then third, this is what I do, the kind of research I do. I'm going to try to pronounce this word. Prosopographical databases, that's what I do. Curtis Hensley explained that to me one time. And you make databases about people and you look up who they are and you figure out who they are, and then you can figure out how they network together and so on, and so that's basically what it is. And what we did is to create these databases of who the primary producers and consumers of American anthropology were from 1879 to the time of the fair, and then and then looked out as far as 1925, I created a periodization scheme. Was devised for these data, and then the implications of the trajectory of American anthropology could be explored using that tool And we show that by 1925, anthropology in America had become an accepted academic and museum profession whose moral center was building a scientific case for the toleration of all peoples. It turns out that in his textbook of 1923, Alfred Kroeber, one of Boas's students, the first real textbook on American anthropology to be published, made the case that anthropology in academia was against the eugenics movement, which was big at that time, and against environmental determinism. And so he pitched the craft of American anthropology between those two polar frightening creatures. And, I can't pronounce it. How do you say Chartibus and Sibylla? You know what I'm talking about? Somebody can pronounce that. I'm terrible at this thing. Anyway, it turns out, though, that eugenics peaked right about 1924 with the Exclusion Act of 1924 that Congress passed. And what began to go downhill after that, its scientific assumptions were shown to be false, untrue. American anthropology grew stronger ever after that, and thus from about 1925. Now, going back to the expedition, Cushing had left Zuni in October of 1888. He was ill again. He went to Boston this time with Mary Hemenway at Old Farm, and he was sent by her to lobby for the Casa Grande being set aside. He again became even more ill. He was in Garfield Hospital. He had tapeworm. And he also had a deformed stomach, so he had diverticulitis as well as a constant problem. And I couldn't go on. And so Jesse Walter Fuchs, who'd been a classmate of Augustus Jr., was sent out, had joined the board by this time, and was sent out to Zuni to check into what was going on. The long and the short of it, he was put in charge. Cushing was dismissed as director. He went home to Albion, New York, in upstate New York, which is on the Erie Canal, railroad went through there. It's not too far from Buffalo, east of Buffalo, north of Batavia, if you know where Batavia is in western New York. And on an old Indian trail, the old Orchard Road was an old north-south Indian trail there that Cushing grew up around. I had a chance with a Hemenway research trip to go there. He had a boyhood friend who's had a famous name today, George Kennan. And this George Kennan was the first Russian expert in America. A later distant relative, also named George Kennan, is the famous one today. But this was a boyhood friend of Cushing's, and Cushing also wrote, one of the first publications was about a fort site west of Albion that I got to go see when I was there. And it's called Neuter Fort, out in the woods now, kind of hard to see today. But this was the farm of Thomas Cushing, his father, where he lived at the time that Cushing went back. But Emma Cushing, his wife, thought that Thomas Cushing was a pine knot. He was a tough character, tough guy to deal with. And so they stayed with their banker friend, Ezra Cohen, in Albion, where they were much more comfortable. And Cushing succeeded in expelling the apeworm using mercury. He then pickled it and wrote to Washington Matthews all about it, and the scientific specimen that he kept. Here's a photograph we have of Cushing reading a newspaper, and one of the children that was, part of the scene there at that time. He got a lot of medical help in Buffalo, where he was able to meet and worm his way into all of the major intellectual elite of Buffalo. Today, the Swan Library is in Albion and has a lot of information about Cushing and other people in that region. Now that he'd begun to recover his health, by the beginning of 1892, Powell hired him back in Washington as an ethnologist at the Smithsonian, at the Bureau. And in addition to other work, the Hemenways wanted him to write up what he'd done. They paid all that money, they wanted a report. And so he began working on one. They called it an itinerary. William Tory Harris, by this time, was in Washington as the U.S. Commissioner of Education, and he had done Cushing for, more, do right, do it faster, do it better, and was the intercessor with Mary Hemenway and her son and their friends. Cushing never got to talk to her again, finally, he'd written 3 portions of this itinerary, and after the third one, for unknown reasons, Augustus Hemenway decided not to pay for it anymore. They decided it wasn't what they wanted, basically. And so, in May of 1893, that was the end of it. And so Cushing, picked himself up, started doing other things. And one of the first things they did is he and his wife was to go to Chicago to the fair, where John Wesley Powell was in charge of the anthropology exhibits at the government building, and Cushing was there to help create them. And this is the fair with the Ferris wheel, first Ferris wheel. We see here a map of it. If you know Chicago, it was in South Chicago around Jackson Park. You know where Jackson Park is, the University of Chicago, just beginning at that time. And the Midway Plaisance here is the southern boundary of the University of Chicago here. This was named Midway Plaisance by Frederick WEB Hodge, who designed Jackson Park and many of the other parks in Chicago. The lake then was right here. Here then is Frederick WEB Hodge. Daniel Hudson Burnham was the director of works at the fair. He was an architect in Chicago who pioneered in some of the early skyscraper technology using steel, which they applied in some ways to building the fair in a very big hurry. He collaborated with a major architect in New York City, Charles McKim Follen, McKim, of McKim, Mead, and White. Many famous buildings are built by them, including the Boston Public Library. They brought together then a great group of artists and architects, one of which was Augustus St. Gaudens, one of the great American sculptors, who said he felt that this was the greatest assemblage of artists since the 15th century. A little modesty. One of them was a man named Frank Millet, who Burnham hired as the director of decorations at the fair, and he was a friend of Sylvester Baxter, and Cushing knew him. And so when he was out walking around in the fair, he ran into Millet, and with Millet was Daniel Hudson Burnham, and so he met Burnham. And Burnham was a Swedenborgian in religion, and Cushing knew something about that. I'm not sure he was himself, but he could converse about it, and they became friends, and eventually Burnham invited him out to his house in Evanston. And so again, he's getting right at the heart of the intellectual elite in this city, in this place. He had that incredible ability to do that. This is one of the paintings that Millet did. He died in the Titanic, by the way. So the fair then was a grand thing in lots of ways. It's still remembered fondly today in many ways. A lot of images were created that are, you can readily access today on the internet. These are a few of them. They reconstructed, Columbus's boats and things. You could, ride around in them. Here in the center of it was what they called the Court of Honor, where there were statues, some of which are still, one of which is still in Jackson Park, and great buildings, but they have a steel foundation, but they're just lath and plaster. It's just all a facade and a way to create a big space in which you could put all these exhibits that it wasn't intended to last. And here we have Frederick WEB Hodge, one of his sculptures. He's the guy who did that sculpture of Henry Vane in the Boston Public Library. This was also the time of electricity and still the debate between Edison and Tesla. Alternating current, though, was just on the cusp of taking off at this time, and the night it was lit up at the fair in spectacular ways. Here is William Metcalf again, who by this time has become a much more established artist and part of what's called the American Impressionist movement, and he exhibited at the fair. And then we have Thomas Hovenden, one of his paintings called Bringing Home Ties, which won one of the medals at the fair. We see this as a symbol of what's happening here is at the time in American life when people are moving from the rural areas to the city increasingly, and urban life is becoming more and more and more important. It hadn't become dominant at this point, but it soon would be. The moral challenges that created are nicely expressed, I think, in this painting. Hovenden was a Philadelphia painter. Now here we have then Frederick WEB Putnam, and his chief assistant was Franz Boas. Now Boas at this time was a young man. He had a PhD. He was a physical anthropologist primarily at this moment, and had a laboratory, measured heads at the fair. He helped Putnam, but he wasn't yet the mover and shaker in American anthropology that he would become in a number of years, and partly because of Putnam's support. And they were responsible for the anthropology building at the fair, a whole separate building. Putnam had given a talk to the business leaders of Chicago and persuaded them to put the money up to do this and to send people out into the field to make collections from basically all over the world and bring them back, which was done. One of the things they did is to make squeezes of Mayan sculptures and to mount those as exhibits outside the anthropology building. Boas brought Kwakiutl Indians and totem poles back, and they had a little Kwakiutl village there, and there were other villages like that as well at this time. Now, meanwhile, you have John Wesley Powell and the government building, and the anthropology exhibits there. His chief assistant for that was William Henry Holmes, and Cushing worked then under Holmes in this effort. Here's the government building in the Court of Honor. And there also were private enterprises, entrepreneurial enterprises. There was something they called Battle Mountain, which they built up, and you could go inside it, and they had basket maker artifacts that they had looted from the Southwest and brought to Chicago from the Mancos River area and others. Battle Mountain is in the Mancos River. There's actually a place that looks like this. The site, though, isn't there. It's across the way from there. Cushing, though, was intrigued by these basket maker artifacts and went back there again and again and again. Some of them went to the University of Pennsylvania later, and he later studied them there, and we publish what he said about them as one of the documents in this book. We then have the Midway. Putnam originally was in charge of it, but he couldn't really handle it, it turned out, and so they brought in a guy, an impresario named Saul Bloom, to do it, and he was successful at that. It turned a profit, and here you have then some of the joys of the Midway. This is where many of the foreign people exhibited, such as the Street of Cairo, and there was Javanese and many others. A great potpourri of different cultures then all came together as people walked past one another on the Midway and could, to one degree or another, interact with one another. And at the junction of the Midway and the fair proper was the Woman's Building, built by a woman architect and with exhibitions by women artists inside. And also then there was a corn kitchen that a woman a cook from Philadelphia had a famous cookbook named Sarah Tyson Rohr, was making things, trying to persuade people that maize could be a human food as well as an animal food. At this time that wasn't accepted. And Cushing provided her with Zuni recipes for the cookbook she put out as a part of this effort. And they became fast friends and for the rest of his life. Oops. The other father of American anthropology, Daniel Garrison Britton, was there to do a Congress of Anthropology. A symposium was brought together over a number of days, and Cushing participated actively in that. Another one who participated from Philadelphia was Stuart Hewlin, who became friends with Cushing at the fair. They were particularly interested in games of the American Indians, and later Hewlin published a famous book, Games of the North American Indians. And if you look in that, you'll see Cushing is mentioned many, many times. They had a long correspondence about this, and it was one of the things that preoccupied Cushing from this time to the rest of his life. He died in 1900. Two other people at the Congress were Alice Cunningham Fletcher and Zillian Nuttall, were famous names in American anthropology. And they were thrilled by what Cushing had to say. He says in his diary that they called him the son, S-U-N, the son of anthropology. I kid you not. Now here's Burnham. Andrew Zorn was a famous painter who did a lot of paintings of people at the fair. Here we see a photograph of Burnham with his son and at home. And so Cushing was invited to his home. He met many of his intellectual friends there. And they came to his talk at the Congress. Nothing else came of that, so far as I know. But you see that he's able to speak to an audience that includes the elite of this place, as well as more common people, if you will, who are just passing past the exhibits that they're doing. That these people they wanted to know what he had to say. And while we don't fully understand what that was, it seems like it's about Zuni religion, his ideas. There were correspondences between Zuni religion and Christianity that these people were concerned about, and that Zuni religion somehow supported some of the presumptions they had about their own religion, and that was something that it seems intrigued them. And we have another document is a lecture Cushing gave in Chicago and Washington D.C. in 1894 about religion, and some of these ideas are set forth there as a glimpse into what people might have gotten excited about at that time. But building an anthropological audience, though, is part of our underlying theme of this whole book. A very important step forward was taken at this fair, but then it's ephemeral, and not very long after it closed, it burned down. All that lath and plaster, gone. Wow. And the mayor of Chicago was assassinated. Now, here we come then to an attempt to summarize briefly Cushing's main accomplishments as an anthropologist and archaeologist. I think it's fair to say he's the first anthropological ethnologist, learning the language of the Zuni to understand them as human beings, starting in 1879. Now there are others, Mooney and others who could be put forward as people doing something similar at this time. First, he's also, I think, the first ethnological archaeologist using his knowledge of Zuni culture to interpret the archaeological record from 1887. He used his knowledge of Zuni culture to postulate settlement patterns, as I'll show you, settlement systems, and to interpret the religious choreography, as I'll call it, of the archaeological record in the late 1880s. He successfully lobbied to have the first prehistoric site in Casa Grande Ruins set aside by the U.S. Congress for permanent preservation in 1889. He helped to create exhibitions that focused on the people being interpreted through their material culture, that is, as Harold Colton would say, ideas, not things, in early 1890s. And he stimulated others to take up professional interest in American anthropology. He discovered later in the 1890s, discovered perishable art and religious objects in the muck of Florida sites in the 1890s and set them in anthropological context. And he pioneered experimental archaeology, replicating many classes of artifacts, including teaching his friend William Henry Holmes about flint knapping, thus one could say helping to clarify the nature of quarry sites and early humans in America. Here we have an example of his religious choreography. We have the Casa Grande. These are two images that Cushing created about his interpretations of that building. I published these in my monograph about Casa Grande. I didn't know at the time that what he's portraying there is what would be called an axis mundi. The four corners of the universe, and in the upper, the middle, and the lower, that's a conception that you find in many parts of the Americas that he saw at Zuni and he saw embodied in this building. He had that kind of imagination, which I find very interesting. And then in the newspapers that McDowell published in the San Francisco Examiner, we found these drawings. We see a basic site unit of a Pueblo pyro mound, which is for cremation, and an earth oven. And then we see a village made up of sets of these with canals, and then a center with an open compound and a temple that is what today called platform mound. So we have site structure there. And then we have a set of those on a canal system along the river, creates then what we can call a larger settlement system. He thought 7 was a key idea here, that when he rode up on top of a platform mound, he could see others, and he immediately, went to this inference about how they're all interconnected. And I, for one, still think that there's a lot of truth in that basic idea. And so later, a famous American archaeologist named Gordon Willey in the 1950s made famous these concepts of settlement pattern and settlement system. So I say, eat your heart out, Gordon Willey. Just kidding. Now, James McClintock was a young student who just graduated from the Tempe Normal School in 1887. He had a newspaper, though, the Salt River Valley News. He later became an Arizona historian. He was a Rough Rider, postmaster, and we have he published a series of articles about the expedition in the Salt River Valley News, one of which is still extant that we found. It's in the Arizona Historical Society Library in the Cummings collection there. And part of it says, and it's a description then of Cushing's interpretations of the settlement structure and its religious choreography and meaning, the center part of which is the main walls of this platform mound and compound constituted the temple as well as a citadel and was the residence of the superior priesthood. That was his primary interpretation. That's still controversial today, although I'm one who thinks that that's probably as close to the truth as we might get. Now, when he died, he swallowed a fish bone. Some people say he choked on it and died, but that isn't true. We have later accounts. He swallowed it and it caused peritonitis, and then he died at age 43. His friend Stuart Cullen said of him then, he was a man of rarely so sympathetic a personality, courteous, warm-hearted, and generous. His early death will be lamented not only by his scientific associates, but by every man, woman, and child with whom he ever came into intimate contact. And here we have Thomas Hovenden's painting of him, which I think reflects this description. And with all of the transcriptions I've done of all of his writings of letters and diaries and on, I think this is the Cushing I've come to know. It's the best expression I can find of the kind of man he was. Now, he was controversial. Some people hated him. I mean, I'm glad nobody hates me, right? Or you. But, he was human. But still, he was one of the founding American anthropologists. He's had an enduring influence And our series is an attempt to dive deep into all of this and to try to understand it in all its ramifications. With that, thank you very much. I have no idea what time it is, but I'll take some questions.
Did Mr. Hemenway ever travel to the west?
Yes, she would come by train, and she went out to Hotel Del Monte in Monterey for the summer a number of times, and I think she was there when it burned down, actually. And William Randolph Hearst immediately sent reporters down to report on that, but I don't think they interviewed her. But she came past Zuni at where Fort Wingate is on the train, and Cushing went out and met with her on the train, and she went on by and then came back. So I don't, to my knowledge, I don't think she ever went to Zuni itself. Other questions? Sorry to keep you so late, if that's what I've done. So, anyway, thank you very much.